Have you ever noticed something strange? The world has never been richer, never more connected, never more productive. Yet somehow, millions of people feel poorer than ever. Every year, technology improves. Every year, businesses become more efficient. Every year, the global economy grows larger. And yet, for ordinary people, life seems to move in the opposite direction. Homes become harder to afford. Education becomes more expensive. Healthcare becomes more expensive. Raising a family becomes more expensive. Retirement feels further away. And financial freedom feels almost impossible to reach. This raises a question that almost nobody asks. If humanity is producing more wealth than at any point in history, where is all that wealth going? Because something doesn't add up. For generations, people were taught a simple formula: study hard, work hard, save money, stay patient, and eventually success will follow. It was a promise repeated by parents, teachers, governments, banks, and financial institutions. For a long time, that promise seemed true. A factory worker could buy a house. A single income could support a family. Saving money felt responsible. The future felt predictable. But today, that world feels increasingly distant. Many people are working longer hours than ever before. Many are earning more money than previous generations. Yet they often feel less secure, less stable, less optimistic. It's as if society is running faster while moving nowhere. And that brings us to one of the most important questions of the modern age. What if the problem isn't individual failure? What if the problem is the system itself? What if the game changed while everyone was still playing by the old rules? To answer that question, we need to go back. Not 10 years, not 20 years, more than half a century. Because the roots of today's financial reality were planted long before most people realized anything had changed. For most of human history, money was connected to something real, something physical, something difficult to create. Gold. Gold had value because it was scarce. It couldn't be printed. It couldn't be created with a keyboard. It required effort to find, extract, and refine. That scarcity created limits, and those limits created discipline. Governments couldn't endlessly create money without consequences. Financial institutions couldn't expand forever. There were boundaries. Then those boundaries disappeared. When money became disconnected from physical scarcity, something remarkable happened. The world entered a completely new era. An era where money could be created far more easily than before. At first, the change seemed harmless. More flexibility, more liquidity, more economic growth. And for a while, the results looked impressive. Markets expanded, businesses expanded, governments expanded, credit expanded. The global economy exploded in size. But hidden beneath that growth was a consequence few people understood. The more money that exists, the less unique each unit becomes. Imagine a small island with 100 gold coins. Those coins represent all available money. Now imagine someone magically creates another 100 coins overnight. Has the island become twice as wealthy? Of course not. The houses are the same. The food is the same. The land is the same. Only the number of coins changed. More money doesn't automatically create more wealth. Sometimes it simply changes how wealth is distributed. And this is where the story becomes interesting. Because when new money enters an economy, it doesn't appear everywhere at the same time. It enters through specific channels. Banks, governments, large institutions, financial markets. The people closest to those channels gain access first, and that creates an advantage. Imagine hearing about a sale before everyone else. You arrive early. You buy the best products at the lowest prices. By the time everyone else arrives, prices have already increased. Modern money often works in a similar way. Those closest to newly created money often acquire assets before prices adjust. Stocks, real estate, businesses, land, technology. By the time the effects reach ordinary workers, prices have already moved higher. This helps explain one of the defining trends of modern history: the extraordinary rise of asset prices. Look at housing. Look at stocks. Look at valuable land. Look at major businesses. Over long periods, these assets have often appreciated far faster than wages. And that creates a world divided into two groups: those who own assets and those who primarily sell time. For decades, people assumed income was the path to wealth, but increasingly, ownership became the path to wealth. That distinction changed everything, because time is limited. Nobody gets more than 24 hours in a day. Ownership scales. A business can grow while you sleep. A software platform can serve millions of people simultaneously. A piece of intellectual property can generate value for years. An investment can compound without requiring additional labor. This doesn't mean work has no value. Far from it. Work remains essential. But work alone no longer guarantees financial progress the way it once did. And perhaps nowhere is this transformation more visible than in the rise of technology. For most of history, leverage belonged to the few. Kings had armies. Industrialists had factories. Media moguls had television networks. The average person had limited access to leverage. Today, that reality is changing. A single creator can reach millions of people online. A single entrepreneur can build a global business from a laptop. A single developer can create software used across continents. Artificial intelligence is accelerating this trend even further. For the first time in history, individuals possess tools that rival the capabilities of entire organizations from previous generations. And that's why the next decade may become one of the most important periods in financial history, because we are witnessing a shift, a migration, not a migration of people across borders, a migration of value, a migration of opportunity, a migration of wealth, from old systems into new systems, from physical leverage into digital leverage, from traditional structures into technological structures. The people who recognize this shift early may position themselves for extraordinary opportunities. The people who ignore it may spend years wondering why the old rules no longer work. History follows a pattern. Every major technological revolution creates winners. Every major technological revolution creates losers. The printing press changed power. The steam engine changed power. Electricity changed power. The internet changed power. Artificial intelligence may become the next chapter in that story. The biggest financial lie ever sold was not that money matters. Money does matter. The lie was convincing people that money itself was the destination. Money was never the destination. Freedom was. Control was. Ownership was. The ability to direct your own future was. And the people who understand that distinction may find themselves on the right side of the next great economic transformation. Because the world is changing. The shift is already happening. The migration has already begun. And the only question remaining is whether you'll recognize it before everyone else does. Ownership is the game. Then we need to ask a much bigger question. Why does ownership seem to win regardless of what happens in the economy? Why do some people become wealthier during booms, recessions, inflation, and even financial crises, while others spend decades working harder just to stay in the same place? The answer begins with a simple fact that most people never think about. For most of human history, debt was a tool. Today, debt is the system. And that distinction changes everything. Imagine walking into a bank and depositing $1,000. Most people assume that money simply sits there, waiting safely until they need it again. But that's not what happens. The moment your money enters the banking system, it becomes part of a much larger machine. The bank lends a portion of it to someone else. That person spends it. The recipient deposits it into another bank. That bank lends part of it again. The cycle repeats over and over. What started as $1,000 suddenly creates several $1,000 worth of economic activity. At first glance, this sounds brilliant. More lending means more businesses, more houses, more investment, more growth. And for decades, that's exactly what happened. Economies expanded. Standards of living improved. Global trade exploded. The modern world was built on credit. But every powerful system contains a weakness. And the weakness of a debt-based economy is that it becomes addicted to growth. Think of a bicycle. As long as the bicycle keeps moving forward, it remains stable. But the moment it stops moving, it begins to fall. The modern financial system operates in a remarkably similar way. As long as borrowing increases, the system continues functioning. Businesses expand, consumers spend, governments invest, markets rise. But when borrowing slows down, something strange happens. Growth begins to weaken, confidence begins to fade, and panic begins to spread. This creates a problem, because debt has a limit. Every household has a limit. Every business has a limit. Every government has a limit. Eventually, there comes a point where taking on more debt becomes difficult. Yet the system still needs growth to survive. And that's where inflation enters the story. Most people think inflation simply means higher prices. But that's only the symptom. The deeper reality is far more important. Inflation often occurs when the supply of money grows faster than the supply of valuable goods and services. Imagine there are 10 people on an island and together they possess 100 coins. Those coins represent all available money. Now imagine someone creates another 100 coins out of thin air. Has the island become twice as productive? Has it doubled its farmland? Doubled its food supply? Doubled its houses? Of course not. The only thing that changed was the number of coins. The same amount of value is now being measured by a larger number of units. And when that happens, prices tend to adjust upward. This is one of the most misunderstood concepts in modern finance. Rising prices are often blamed on businesses, supply chains, or temporary events. Sometimes those factors matter, but over long periods of time, the value of money itself becomes one of the biggest pieces of the puzzle. The more Daniel studied this idea, the more he realized something unsettling. The system wasn't failing. It was functioning exactly as designed. When economies weaken, policymakers often face an impossible choice: allow painful contractions to occur, or introduce more liquidity into the system. Again and again throughout modern history, the decision has been remarkably similar. More credit, more borrowing, more money. And every time this happens, a question emerges. Who receives that money first? Because new money does not arrive everywhere at the same time. This is where one of the most important concepts in economics enters the story. Imagine a giant fountain standing in the center of a city. Fresh water enters from the top. The people standing closest to the source drink first. They receive the cleanest water, the greatest quantity, the biggest advantage. By the time the water flows down to everyone else, much of that advantage has already disappeared. Money behaves in a surprisingly similar way. When new money enters an economy, it usually flows through specific channels: banks, financial institutions, governments, large corporations, asset markets. The people closest to those channels often receive the benefits. Before prices fully adjust, they buy assets while prices are still relatively low. They invest before inflation spreads throughout the economy. They position themselves before the effects become visible to everyone else. Meanwhile, ordinary workers experience the process differently. By the time higher wages arrive, if they arrive at all, many prices have already moved upward. Housing costs have increased. Asset prices have increased. Living expenses have increased. This helps explain a pattern that has puzzled millions of people around the world. Why do stock markets often reach record highs, while ordinary families feel financially stressed? Why do asset owners become wealthier while wage earners struggle to keep pace? Why does inequality continue widening despite technological progress? The answer isn't always greed. It isn't always corruption. Often, it's structure. The structure itself creates the outcome. Daniel realized that the world had quietly separated into two groups. The first group primarily earned income from labor. The second group primarily benefited from ownership. The first group exchanged time for money. The second group owned things that increased in value as money flowed through the system. One group depended on paychecks. The other depended on assets. And over long periods of time, the difference became enormous. A person can only work so many hours, but ownership has no such limit. A business can expand. A stock portfolio can grow. A piece of software can serve millions of customers. A valuable asset can appreciate for decades. This doesn't mean work is useless. Work remains the foundation of every economy, but work alone is increasingly being outperformed by leverage. And leverage is where the story begins to change. Because for most of history, leverage belonged to a small number of people. Kings had armies, industrialists had factories, media companies had television networks. The average person had very little access to leverage. Today, that reality is changing faster than ever before. Technology is creating entirely new forms of leverage. A creator can build a global audience from a bedroom. A programmer can create software used across continents. An entrepreneur can launch a business that operates 24 hours a day, without physical offices. For the first time in history, individuals have access to tools that once belonged only to large organizations. And that's why the next chapter of this story is so important. Because the biggest shift isn't happening inside banks. It isn't happening inside governments. And it isn't happening on Wall Street. It's happening in technology. It's happening online. It's happening inside the new digital economy. While millions remain focused on surviving the present, a new generation of wealth creators is positioning itself for the future. They are building audiences, building software, building brands, building systems, and most importantly, they are building ownership, because they understand something that Daniel only recently discovered. The goal was never to collect the most money. The goal was to own the things that money flows into. And once you understand that distinction, you begin seeing the world differently. You stop asking how to earn slightly more and start asking how to create leverage. You stop focusing only on income and start focusing on ownership. You stop thinking like an employee and start thinking like a builder, because the next decade may create opportunities unlike anything the modern world has ever seen. The people who recognize that shift early may find themselves on the right side of history. That people who ignore it may spend years wondering why the old rules stopped working. And that's exactly where our story goes next, because the greatest wealth migration in modern history has already begun. Most people simply haven't noticed it yet. But here's the truth. The story doesn't end here. We've uncovered how money is created. We've exposed why inflation quietly erodes purchasing power. And we've seen why simply working harder is no longer enough. But one question still remains. If this is how the system works, then who benefits the most? In the next chapter, we'll uncover the great wealth migration, the silent shift that's changing how wealth is created, who owns the future, and why the biggest opportunities of the next decade may already be here. Because the people who build the future aren't the ones who wait for change. They're the ones who recognize it first. If you found this documentary valuable, subscribe and join us for the next chapter. Until then, stay curious, stay informed, and remember, the biggest financial advantage isn't having more money. It's understanding the game before everyone else does. I'll see you in the next one.